All right. Okay, so welcome to this topic of socialization when it comes to unconventional education paths. So I'm Stephanie Sewell. I work as an alternative education consultant. I came to that work as a now retired homeschooling or unschooling parent, as is the phrase that is often used. And I'm associated with Unschooling School and the concept that they have of helping people to find an unschooling type of experience or reality while still being able to use the amazing resource that school and its people can be. So I think the concept of socialization within that framework is also really interesting. It's not, these are people who are not necessarily just at home, but looking to be partially at home, partially at school. So how does socialization look there as well? So I chose this topic for today because it's such a common thing. When you say that you homeschool your kids or you're thinking of pulling your kids out of school, the most common reaction is, but what about the socialization? And, homeschooling, unschooling parents alternately get really uncertain and insecure about their choice as a result of those questions, or they just get really fed up with those questions because it's so obvious to them that for their child or teen, the social piece is actually perhaps better outside of a school setting. So what I want to do here is sort of bring up some ideas that I've thought of in connection with this topic. I'm not going to advocate a perfect solution to it, but then basically open up the floor so that we can share reflections on the ideas I brought forward and discuss whatever's in your heads and hearts about this topic. So as I was mentioning before all of you joined, I thought that I should probably actually look up a definition of socialization since I was going to be talking about it. And I found it really interesting because, of course, there's the social interaction with others piece of it. But the two different places that I looked up said, the first place said this: it's a process beginning during childhood by which individuals acquire the values, habits, and attitudes of their society. And then the other one talked about the process of learning one's culture and how to live within it. And I'd never really thought about it in those terms. And Sydney, to your question about how do we socialize adults, how do we as adults find socialization post lockdowns and all of that? I find that notion that socialization is the process of learning one's culture, the norms of one's culture. I just think that's a really interesting concept. And it gave rise to a whole other way of thinking, which I haven't had time to reflect on. But one of the things that people are often concerned about with school is that it's kind of creating people that are a result of the school system rather than the result of families. So if we think that socialization is the process of learning to be within one's culture, the norms, behaviors, values, etc., and if socialization is normally done within school, then wow, that really speaks to why or how strong the school is in creating the culture in which we live. And maybe that's obvious to others. It kind of blew my mind as I just hadn't thought about that particular aspect of it. So I'll leave that with you as something to ruminate on. And then I'm going to go to the more, straightforward concept of socialization, which is that idea of what we interact with others, and talk about it particularly for kids who are home or unschooling, or kids who are at home but perhaps have some kind of free learner association with the school. So I think, first of all, it's really important to put on the table the fact that we have a whole lot of assumptions about this socializing idea of social interactions with others. We are used to thinking as a society that school is a good way of socializing. That's just kind of like, well, of course you're going to socialize at school. And of course, if your child goes to school, they're going to be well socialized. These are things that even as parents who are looking at alternatives for our kids, we often have that assumption. And it takes us a while to kind of pull that one out of our pocket and look at it and go, oh, is that actually what I believe to be true? So part of that assumption is that idea that to be socialized, or you need to have 6 hours a day, 5 days a week of interaction with other kids. That those other kids should be roughly the same age as you. That socialization should be supervised, if we think about a recess context, or controlled, if we think about a classroom context, right? Now is the time that you can talk. Now is the time that you can't talk. This is a group project. You can choose your partner. This is a group project. You have to go with the person I assigned you to. So all of these ways that socialization is determined by the adults who are around. Another assumption we have, I think, is that being alone is often bad, or that somebody who's a child or teen who chooses to be alone, we have that question of like, is it because they can't be with others? Like, are they kind of maybe not socialized? Like, there's that assumption that I think is around as well. I think we also, this is perhaps not such an obvious one, but I think we assume that socializing should or is best done without being in the presence of a parent at the same time. And what I mean by that is, even for pretty young kids, we're encouraged to like drop our kid off at a playgroup, drop them off at daycare. The idea that you might want a child to be able to kind of venture a few steps away from their parent, have a little conversation, then come back to like reground, and then go out again and come back. We don't really accept that, or we're not too excited about that as a concept. We generally think that kids from a pretty young age should be able and wanting to socialize without the parents being around. And then going back to the idea of 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, and assumptions, I think we're also used to thinking that that's enough, that if kids go to school and they get that social time, that they're done. But in fact, I would argue that a lot of kids haven't even started at the end of that 5 day week, 6 hours a day. They now need to actually have time to interact with others on their terms without it being controlled in their own way. And I think the last assumption that I want to bring forward is this idea that, if you have a child who's struggling at school socially, we often think, well, got to learn to deal with those bullies, and got to learn to make do with the people that you don't like, or like these are, you just got to suck it up, and I did it, and look how I turned out. Like all of these kinds of things that, as soon as we think a little bit deeper, we'll probably find our way to questioning that. But it often tends to be our first assumption as adults, that it's good to figure out the socialization piece at school, even if it's not feeling really nourishing. So those are some of the assumptions that came to my mind as I thought about it. And certainly later you can add to them as needed. If you have thoughts on them, that's great. So based on those assumptions, what I wanted to do is highlight what I see as some of the problems. And I've talked about some already, but there's a really big one that I think is important to name. And that is that when people are in school, they're not usually in a consensual situation. We don't think of school as being something that you choose to go to. One of the things we talk about when we talk about consent is without the opportunity to leave the situation, you haven't actually consented to it. You might have consented, but if you can't then also leave, that it becomes a bit of a problem. So if we look at this assumption of socialization that happens within school is normal or standard socialization, then it's always happening amongst children and teens who are in a situation that they haven't fully deeply consented to, and that they can't just leave. So I think that's, again, something interesting to consider, because it brings to the foreground, who are you when you socialize? And I think this is an important thing that springboards into thoughts of socialization when your kids are outside of school. If you want your child to have the opportunity to interact with others and to, to gain those values and norms, etc., of society, I think it makes sense that the child or teen, would be coming from their deepest sense of who they truly are when they're engaging in that way. So if you've got somebody who's at school and is stressed because they're an introvert and they just find it really hard to be around people all that much, and that's the place, that the energy, the part of their being from which they're trying to build their social skills, and that can be pretty tough, and it can feel like a real relief to them when they step into a different environment for socializing where they can be much more their true self. So I think that's an interesting question, is when we're thinking about socializing intentionally, are we creating an opportunity for our child to socialize from their sense of who they truly are? The last thing that I want to highlight about school as, again, something that we might not think about, which is a challenge with socializing at school, more and more, there is this in-person connection in socialization. Yes, they're going to the building, they're seeing people there, there's that connection. And there's this parallel social interaction universe online. So if you're somebody who is in grade 7 or 8 and doesn't have a phone, and all the other people, or most of them, are interacting outside of school on social media, well, almost by definition, you become an outcast. Never mind any other aspect of your social engagement, you're not part of that part of the conversation. So that adds in a real challenge. And in some ways, maybe it's an advantage because you don't have to deal with all of those elements, but it definitely means that you're missing part of it. And then again, we've got the situation where it's heavily controlled within the school setting and then not controlled in the online setting that exists in parallel. So that is a really new scenario that we're having to deal with, is this, how does that play out for different kids? How does it play out for the kids who are feeling really comfortable in person with their peers, but then they're not as comfortable online? Or for the kids who are super comfortable online, but then they can't bring that into a face-to-face, and nobody's really realizing what the issues are and how to work through them. So I think that's something to bring an awareness to, is when we're being intentional about creating social opportunities. Are those in person? Are they online? Are they some blend? And just to be aware of that. So if we turn to the reality that you've Marley and Pam, you both talked about, of having a child or teen who's outside of school, and now what does it look like to create those opportunities? One thing that when we were homeschooling, a homeschooling mom of older kids said to me is that you have to accept as a homeschooler that some years it'll be like you're in the most wonderful tribe of supportive community and your kids are off playing all the time and everybody's super happy. And then the next year, it might be like being on a desert island because one person moved, one person went to school, another person, whatever it is. So there can be that, it can be really empty socially, or it can be really rich and full socially. And it's not always something that's within your control. So that's something to be aware of. I think going back to the online in-person thing, again, being intentional around the opportunities that we're helping our kids to create for themselves or creating for them, that's a decision. Does our child or teen feel that an online social group is a social group or not? Is it possible for them to kind of take a lot of what they need from that and be okay if the in-person stuff is pretty thin on the ground? Or is that, like, I know I have teens that I work with who are like, I don't want anything online. I don't want any social, academic, like nothing. I'm done. I don't want online. Marley's nodding emphatically. So, and that's a reality. So again, it's something just to be aware of. And it helps you focus your efforts, and it helps you to recognize what the challenges or the opportunities might be. And a really positive thing that I found with thinking about socialization outside of school is to open up your understanding of what socialization is, what it is to have a friend, what it is to spend time with people. And an example of that that comes from my son's life, and I have a new client who just mentioned exactly the same thing to me, mountain bike trail building. So my son is Oliver, and he would go off and build trails, either as a job once he was 15 or 16, and before that as a volunteer or as part of kind of the mountain bike community. He would build trails. And the other people were usually older than him, sometimes by as much as 10 or 15 years. And he came back so full and nourished and happy and socially, whatever, nourished, happy, it's like socially good from those opportunities. Though obviously, like our initial thought was like, well, there's no other person who's his age, but so once we open up our understanding of what it is to be social, that can help dramatically with the reality of seeking social context outside of a school setting. So things like volunteering, things like working, things like seeking multi-age settings, and realizing that, if you've got a program that's for 10 to 16-year-olds and your child is 15, it might not work out, but it might also work out beautifully. And we're not necessarily used to thinking like that. We're used to looking for the thing where they're all about the same age. Also to recognize that it doesn't have to be 5 hours, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. It doesn't even have to be every day. Once a week, once every 2 weeks, if it's really nourishing and rich, might be exactly the right thing for a person. It really depends on them, and also on the child and teen as they start to adjust their mindset around what they're looking for. And again, if you have, like, say you find some amazing program or some opportunity that has them happy half a day a week with the peer group that feels good for them, maybe those relationships then start to be nourished online outside of that time because they know they can come back together. So that kind of thing can happen as well. So circling back to the idea of the unschooling school, which is the free learner, the idea that you might be unschooling based, but using the resources of school, there's so much potential there. If you think about trying to create a situation where a child can go to some kind of school environment for a day a week, or 2 days a week, or 2 half days, or whatever it is, then that might be part of their socialization as well. Something that most people are doing full time, but maybe for them, that conscious, I'm going to go and do this part-time, will actually allow them to find that social time that nourishes them. It really depends on the kids. And there was one other thing I know I had written down somewhere. So then the last thing I would say about all of this before I open up the floor for general conversation is to really think about the idea of consent in it all. I think that's probably the biggest piece, because if you have a teen who's at home and they're feeling it's hard to make connections with other teens, if we come back to that idea of, well, what is it that you will feel good about potentially getting into, that you can probably also leave, that you can opt out of if you need to. If we start from that place, if the conversation starts from there, I think the conversation has the possibility to really open up lots of different avenues. It's easy to start from the, like we should be fine, like we're trying to find a program, we're trying to find something that's 3 days a week, and if something like that doesn't exist, it doesn't exist in our neighborhood or our city. So the more we can get back to like the very, very basic with our child or teen of what is it that you're seeking? Is it that you just want someone to be in the same room as while you're gaming? Is it like, what is it that you wish you had? And then to think as creatively as possible about that. You might find yourself a month down the road realizing, oh, that socialization thing kind of sorted itself out because we really started with where they're at right now. Because we just have no idea how it will all work out and what's going to feel good once a child gets really far away from that mainstream mindset. If it's supposed to be like this, it's amazing. I've heard of like 12-year-olds who consider their best friend is 8 years old. And we would just never think of that unless we came from this place of what feels good. When do you come home feeling good? So that's what I want to say about it. And because it's sort of connected, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that Peter Gray, who many of you have probably heard of, is speaking online this evening at 7:30 Eastern about school-based anxiety. And I think it's a really worthwhile conversation to have. And Peter is amazing. It's great to listen to him speak about anything. But this notion of school-based anxiety is so often coming in part out of the socialization piece. I suspect he'll have some interesting things to say, and it could be a really nice follow-up to this conversation at noon. So if you're interested in that, I forgot to have the link ready, but I know I've shared it on my Facebook. It's in the Unschooling School Facebook, so you can find it easily. And if you don't find it, then just email me and I'll send you the link directly. Put my email in chat in just a moment. All right, Marley, go ahead.
Just to add to that, my registration link says it's at 7, just putting that out there.
Sorry, I heard my registration, that I missed what you said after that.
Oh, sorry. The registration link I have for the event this evening says 7 to 8, not 7:30.
Thank you. Thanks, Marley. Crowdsourcing accuracy. That's what we need. All right, so I'm going to turn the recording off and turn it over to you as a group to reflect, and feel free to bring any of your personal situations to this conversation. If anybody's watching this and wants to share thoughts about it, that you can put them in the chat, because this will be available on our YouTube channel, or get into the conversation on the Unschooling School Facebook group. Right, so see you next time.